Thanks, Mark. Thank you, Valerie, once again. And in the spirit of supporting those who may have suffered from trauma, or really any of us when we feel dysregulated and overwhelmed and unsafe in our body, in our heart, and our mind, we'll be offering some modifications today as we practice. And you can avail yourself of those. The key is really to be in choice here and to be able to practice in a way that feels safe and supportive. Just want to recap real quickly. On Monday, we got a sense for the map, right, of the inner world and the ways in which, in traversing inward, as it were, with our mindful attention from the world of the body into the world of the heart, into the world of the mind, and finally into the world of pure consciousness, we might begin to feel a greater sense of dveikut, a greater sense of intimacy with, connection with, a sense of cleaving to the divine. Yesterday we really explored the practice of going low to go high, as it were, right? Which is to say, dropping down into the body, into the Merkava, into our inner chariot to kind of create a vehicle or a vessel for consciousness to manifest more clearly, more brightly, and more expansively in our being. And we also explored the ways in which contemplative prayer practice can be brought into and folded into our meditation practice in a classical Hasidic manner. Today we're going to be turning toward the next level, the next dimension of our being, which is the level of the heart, level of our emotional life. As we begin to learn how to move from one inner dimension of our inner life to another, and as it were, climb the ladder of ascent, Sulam HaAliyah, as it's described in the Zohar, and then throughout the Hasidic literature. And again, I just want to remind us that this language of a ladder, right, can feel very vertical, right? Like we're trying to climb up to some transcendent realm and escape this earthly realm, when in fact, the journey is actually a journey inward into deeper dimensions of our being. So please try, if you can, to translate in your own heart and mind any language that feels vertical, right, into language of an inner or inwardly directed journey into deeper and deeper dimensions of our own being. Adi will share today's source sheet, and I'll share it as well on my screen right now, but Adi will put the link in the chat so that anyone who wants to follow along can. What we're looking at here, once again, is a text from Rabbi Yitzchak Morgenstern from his book Yam HaChochma, The Ocean of Wisdom, which, by the way, is what the Dalai Lama's name means, Ocean of Wisdom, and a particular discourse or treatise here that was composed in 5766 called The Discourse on the Way of Non-Duality or of Unification. And we're going to be looking at a particular section called the Fourth Gate, because he's really kind of taking us on a graded path here, the feeling of rising through the worlds. So if you recall, when we started, we talked about the four worlds, right? And you can look over here in the leftmost column, right? These are all dimensions through which the divine becomes manifest in creation, eventually manifesting as our physical world with all of its separate objects and a multitude of creations, right? And that is the world of Asiya, the world of the body. And that's the world we were exploring yesterday through the practice of direct sensing, and which through the prayer service can be accessed and cultivated through the morning blessings. Today, we're going to be beginning to explore upon that foundation, right, of embodiment, how to use our meditative prayer practice to begin to infuse more consciousness into the world of our emotional life, the world of Yetzirah, which technically means formation, right? We're going to actually be working to form certain emotional qualities in the heart through our practice. And we'll be using a part of the prayer, at least a snippet from the morning service called Pesukei de Zimra, verses of song. The word Zimra can mean song, but it can also mean to prune. So I like to translate this section as heart pruning songs, a section of heart pruning songs, where we can take verses from the Psalms, which were originally songs, and we can contemplate them in such a way as to kind of prune away the hard, protected layers of the heart, and instead open the heart to greater openness and receptivity. And in particular, today we'll be exploring particular emotional qualities around love and awe. So that's just kind of a sense for where we're headed. What I'd like to do now is turn to the text. We're not going to look at the whole selection because I want to get into practice a little bit more quickly today so that we have a more spacious time for practice. So again, we're looking at this Hasidic source. It's a contemporary source, but drawing on all of the Hasidic teachings and the Kabbalistic teachings around contemplative Jewish prayer. Our teacher, Rabbi Morgenstern, says, now the absorption of the first degree that we encountered yesterday is engraving using thoughts of accepting the yoke of the sovereignty of heaven. Yesterday, we encountered this practice of engraving where you essentially you situate or establish yourself with your mindfulness in a particular dimension of being. Yesterday, in particular, we were in the first dimension, which is the dimension of the body, right? The vehicle for our spiritual life to become more manifest. And then, then we engrave, as it were, a holy phrase from the prayer service into the fabric of our psyche, into the fabric of our nervous system by repeating it again and again and etching it into our consciousness, right? And he suggests that when we're in this first level of the body, the kind of engraving that we do, which is to say the kinds of thoughts we want to be repeating in our mind, are thoughts around accepting the yoke of the sovereignty of heaven. That's a classical concept that comes from the rabbinic period. In Hebrew, it reads Kabbalat ol malchut shamayim, receiving or accepting the yoke of the sovereignty of heaven. That might sound like an esoteric idea, but essentially it means that we accept upon ourselves to fulfill the divine will, right? And in a traditional Jewish idiom, to do the mitzvot, right? To actually carry out the mitzvot, the commandments, as we are enjoined to do. Which, by the way, in and of itself is a kind of a way of surrendering our own ego, right, to a higher power. Because, for example, let's take keeping kosher, right? I may want to eat from this deli over here, right? And my ego really craves and desires that particular sandwich, right? But what I'm doing when I keep kosher and I say, I'm actually going to go to this other kosher deli over here where they don't have that sandwich, is I'm saying, there's a higher will that governs my life here. Okay. And I'm going to surrender my egoic desires and preferences to that higher will. So he says we can actually contemplate and engrave, really focus upon deeply and intently and ongoingly on thoughts of surrender, right, to the divine, surrender to the divine. And when we are successful in our meditation and we feel the spiritual light, which is to say we experience a kind of infusion of consciousness in the body, right? This is a sign that we've arrived at the level of chokhmah in the world of asiya. So remember, the world of asiya is the world of the body. And chokhmah, which means wisdom, right, refers to pure consciousness in our tradition, right, or spirit. Pure consciousness, out of which wisdom flows, okay? We might call it the wisdom mind. And when we begin to feel an infusion of consciousness within the body itself, we can know, right, that spirit is now manifest in embodied form. Spirit is now manifest in embodied form. And we've been successful in really entering into the spiritual dimension of asiya, of the world of asiya. Because the world of Asiya has a concrete dimension, right? Our physical reality, but it has a spiritual dimension when we do this work and we feel an infusion of consciousness. Right? The body, as it were, begins to glow with consciousness. So some people asked, how do I know where I am, and whether I've reached my goal? He's giving us a sign here, right? When you begin to feel that the body is really radiant, is really full of consciousness, then you know that you've reached the spiritual realm of Asiya. And he goes on to say, we receive the spiritual light by our readiness to take it upon ourselves to fulfill the divine command. Right? Now, I realize that not all of us here are observant Jews, right? Or necessarily even Jewish at all. Right? And the idea of accepting all of the mitzvot upon ourselves as obligations may feel off-putting or out of step with your your spiritual life. And so one way we might understand receiving the yoke of the kingdom of heaven upon ourselves in a mindfulness idiom is actually learning how to cultivate a sense of equanimity or balanced acceptance with what is, right? If we understand everything as the Hasidic masters do as a part of the divine unfolding, right, then whatever is unfolding right here and now is part of the divine unfolding. And we can grow in our capacity to say, yes, this too, right? Anger is arising. Yes, this too, right? Craving is arising. Yes, this too. There's a sense of surrender to what is, right? And so whether you are more traditionally inclined and you want to take it upon yourself as a practice in the way that it's described here in the text, or whether you'd prefer to go in the direction that I'm offering here, right, which is that we can essentially surrender to the divine unfolding of this moment. Right? Either way, these are ways in which we can create the possibility that the body itself can become a chariot, as it were, for an infusion of divine consciousness. Let me pause there for a second and let us take that in. Okay. So I'll be guiding us in how to do that through this contemplative prayer practice in just a minute. He says, though, that next, we can use our imagination to engrave holy thoughts that arouse awe and love. So now we're entering the world of Yetzirah, the domain of the heart, right? And these two emotions are very prominent in Hasidic spirituality. Ahava, love, and yira, awe, which also connotes a sense of fear, right? It's kind of awe and reverence mixed with a sense of trepidation or fear. When we recognize that we're in the presence of the absolute, right, and the tremendous power of that absolute entity. And so, it's true, as we said a couple of days ago, that our emotions can kind of hijack our sense of well-being and our sense of connection, and they can cause us to be reactive and so on and so forth, and they can firm up a separate sense of self. But these two particular emotions, love and awe, they can actually cut through our emotional reactivity and help us to begin to cultivate a sense of being connected to and absorbed within a field of pure divine love and power, right? Which, says our teacher, is a higher level of absorption, of meditative absorption within the divine source. And afterwards, after we do that, I'm going to teach us how to do that again in just a minute. We merit to feel the spiritual delight of chokhmah pertaining to awe and fear and love of the divine, right? Awe/fear and love of the divine, which is, once again, right, the heart can feel an infusion of consciousness. The heart can begin to feel an infusion of consciousness such that the concrete life of our emotional being can suddenly take on a kind of spiritual dimension, right? Where spirit now is permeating the heart. And when that happens and we feel a kind of infusion of consciousness in the heart, a kind of expansion of the heart into love, into awe, right? and a sense that divine love and divine awe are really permeating our heart, then we have arrived at the spiritual dimension of the world of Yetzirah. We're no longer inhabiting a kind of small, protected, and kind of armored heart. The heart is now open, right, and fully bathed in spirit, we might say. So that's the journey. And one thing I want to say quickly about this is that as we traverse from the world of Asiya, the world of the body, to the world of Yetzirah, the world of the spiritual heart, right? Let me say it again. As we traverse from the world of the spiritual body to the world of the spiritual heart, right? We don't leave the body behind. Each subsequent level, right, in our dive into the deeper depths of our inner life takes with it, right? It both transcends on the one hand, but also takes with it or includes the lower dimensions, right? So we're going to continue to focus on embodied awareness, even as we turn in just a moment to cultivating the spiritual heart. So that's just kind of a clear description, A, of what we're doing today. B, how do we know when we're ready to move on to the next phase from the level of the body, right? And C, what we can actually contemplate when we're in each of these dimensions, right? The part that we're going to add now is that we're going to actually use prayer speech, right? Or the words of prayer as the grounds for actually cultivating the kinds of thoughts that our teacher here is describing, okay? And when we enter the world of Yetzirah today, let me share my screen just for one more second, and then we're going to jump into meditation practice. We're going to use a section, a small portion of the Pesukei de Zimra, the heart pruning songs section, right? Kol haneshama tehalel. This is the final verse in the book of Psalms. And may all that breathes praise Yah, praise the breath of life, praise God, praise the divine. Hallelujah, praise God. And there's a beautiful teaching by Rabbi Levi who says in the name of Rabbi Hanina, these are two classical rabbis, it is incumbent upon us to praise our Creator for each and every breath we breathe. Why, or how do we know this? And he cites our verse here, may all that breathes praise Yah, which he understands to mean every breath must praise Yah, which is to say every breath is a prayer. Right? And I'm going to invite us to experience each and every breath as an opportunity for cultivating awe and love through the lens of this prayer. Right? The in-breath itself, we can experience as an expression of divine love, right? Because here we are, right? And through a whole series of processes, we are being breathed into life once again, right? That's a tremendous expression of loving kindness that's given freely by the whole universe. And then we breathe out. And as one of the Hasidic masters, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, teaches, every time we breathe out, it's kind of like a mini death, right? And that's where we can begin to experience a sense of awe or even a little bit of trepidation, right? That, everything's always changing and there's really no solid ground. There's nothing to cling to. Everything that we hold dear is actually changing and eroding and eventually will pass away, including our very life, right? But then again, there's another infusion of love, right? And then we surrender into awe and fear. And then there's love, and then there's awe and fear, right? And what happens when we experience the breath as a conduit for feeling these waves of divine love coming to us, and then we surrender into the natural passing away that is part and parcel of this created world that we inhabit. So we're going to be exploring that, and I'll give us instructions. And what I'd like to invite us to do right now is actually to begin to settle in. So I'll have a longer sit today, more like 20 minutes. And I'll provide us with all of the instructions that we need and provide plenty of open space as well, silent space. And the first thing I want to invite us to do is to really relax into our Merkava, into our chariot, and establish our posture. Your eyes can be open or closed. If they're open, I want to invite you to allow them to be downcast so that you're not focusing on someone's face or on the screen, but instead on something more neutral. And you can maintain a soft gaze, and then you might take a couple of deep breaths, breathing all the way down into your belly and releasing. And with each in breath, the invitation is to become a little more present. With each out breath, to relax a little bit more into this chariot of the body. And as with our prayer practice yesterday, we can come back to that phrase, Roka ha'aretz al hamayim. The divine places firm ground upon the waters. And we can feel that solidity and stability underfoot. And allow ourselves to settle a little bit more. A little bit less striving in the body and a little bit more relaxing and surrendering into gravity. And remember, our teacher taught us that in this world of asiya, the world of the body, we can begin to draw an infusion of consciousness into our very body, into our very tissues, by contemplating thoughts of surrender. Surrender to the moment. Surrender to the way things are here and now. So I want to invite you to surrender into the breath, or alternatively, if the breath doesn't feel like a safe home base for you, you might focus on sound. Or if you're more traditionally inclined, you might actually say to the divine, I surrender. I'm at your service. And we just come back moment by moment by moment to this intention to surrender, to accept what is, to give up the ego's habitual chasing after this, that, or the other, and instead just be here now. If a thought arises and intrudes upon your meditation, surrender to that. Yes, this too. By and by, you'll find yourself returning to your anchor, the breath, sounds, thoughts of surrender to the divine. And you'll start again. See if you can sense what's happening in the body from within the body itself. Allow consciousness to actually infuse the body. And notice what happens if you give your whole body, surrender your whole body into this field of consciousness. You might notice as well how, as you sit with sensations in the body, there's chokhmah, there's wisdom, intuitive wisdom here that flows directly from consciousness or awareness, which says and knows immediately, spontaneously, ah, yes, the breath is like this, or sound is like this, or surrendering my whole being to the divine is like this. And perhaps you are beginning to feel a deeper infusion of consciousness, kind of like walking in a mist of awareness, where the light of consciousness, little by little by little, moment by moment, begins to really saturate the body. So if you're feeling that, you can move on with me into the world of Yetzirah, the world of the heart, not leaving the body behind, continuing to anchor our attention down into the body. Or you could just stay in the world of Asiya for a while longer. There's no rush here. As we move into the world of Yetzirah, I want to invite you to bring some awareness to what's happening for you right now at the emotional level. You might feel the awareness traveling up a little bit into the heart center. And even as you continue to focus on breath or sounds, you may notice there are emotions present here. Of course, if staying in your core in this way is triggering and dysregulating, you can always go back to sound or the sensation of breathing. See if you can meet whatever is here with kind, balanced acceptance. Ah, yes, this is anger. Ah, yes, this is fear. Ah, yes, this is delight. Ah, yes, this is confusion. You belong. And then we turn to our prayer practice with the phrase Kol Haneshama Tehalleliyah Hallelujah, which I've distilled into English as every breath a prayer. You can repeat the mantra in English or the prayer mantra in Hebrew, Kol Haneshama Tehalleliyah Hallelujah, if you're familiar with it. In English, again, it's every breath a prayer, point of connection with the divine. You can coordinate the words with the breath, with the rising and falling of the breath. So, for example, Kol on the in-breath, Haneshama on the out-breath, Tehalel on the in-breath, Ya on the out-breath, Hallelu on the in-breath, and Ya on the out-breath. Or in English, every on the in-breath, breath on the out-breath, A on the in-breath, prayer on the out-breath. And if you're focusing on sounds, that's fine. See if you can do that, but also keep a portion of your attention focused on the prayer mantra. Could replace breath with sound, every sound a prayer. Keeping breath or sound in the background and the mantra in the foreground of your attention. And as you do this, see if you can incline the mind toward love and awe. So if you're focusing on the in-breath, see if you can incline the mind in such a way that it might experience the in-breath as an expression of vast, transcendent love, a gift given freely by the whole universe. And then as you breathe out, see if you can incline the mind toward experiencing the out-breath as a kind of surrender into impermanence and the vast wave of living and dying that is part and parcel of this divine creation. And notice what that awakens in your heart, if anything. The same with sound. The arising of sound can be experienced as an expression of divine love. Wow. Something new came into the world. Something was born, and I'm conscious of it. And as sound passes away, a small death, recognition of our own limitations, our own mortality, our own impermanence. Surrender into that. And perhaps at some point you might begin to feel a deeper infusion of consciousness into the heart. A sign that you've reached the spiritual Asiya dimension, the spiritual Yetzirah dimension, the dimension of the spiritual heart. And let's remember the Baal Shem Tov's instruction point. We ascend and descend. So when you're ready, you can let the world of Yetzirah go, the world of the heart. Open to love and awe. And deep devotion. And come back into the body fully, wholly, in the present moment. Feeling your seat. Feeling the feet grounded, making contact with the earth. Perhaps taking a couple of moments to rub your hands together or give yourself a face massage, sensing the body making contact with itself, full of consciousness, full of light, full of presence. You can let that go and open your eyes if they've been closed as we turn to Mourner's Kaddish.
Thank you so much, Sam. What a joy this week to be on this journey with you together. Friends, we seal our practice as we always do by offering an opportunity for those who are mourning, those observing yard site, to recite the Mourner's Kaddish, and those who do, you're invited to share the name or names of those you're honoring today in the chat box. Those who are not reciting Kaddish are Here it's an opportunity to practice presence, loving presence for those who are, by staying here, by staying present. And those who are reciting Kaddish, invite you to rise in body or in spirit and join me. Yitkadal, Yikadash, Rabbi,
Amen.
Divrad, V'Tifteh, V'Enriched,
Dash Meraba,
Chayachon, V'Chayachon, V'Chayachon,
Chayfon, Enriched, Chai כל בטוחים,
Rabba Baba,
Rabba,
Rabba, B'Ram, 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 Barak, Ishtabach, V'Chol, V'Tifteh, V'Kadav, V'Kare, V'Kadash, Shne V'Chol, והעם עם כל ברכתה ושיר התפוס לכם, אתה באמרן בעלמה ואמרו,
Amen.
שלמה רבה מן השמיים יחסן עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו,
Amen.
שלום ומעט, יעשה שלום עלינו, וישראל,
Amen. Shalom
Amen.
B'Mamad. Yaseh Shalom Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'al Kol Yoshvei Tevel. Amen.
Amen.
Friends, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks, of course, to Valerie Taylor for sponsoring our practice, not only today, but for this full week of practice with Rabbi Sam Feinsmith. Thanks, as always, to Adi Stein, who holds us all together technologically with skill and grace. For those who are leaving now, we want to wish you a good, safe, healthy rest of the day. Lots of blessings to you. We hope we'll see you tomorrow to practice with Sam at the same time. For those who are staying on, which you're welcome and encouraged to do, if you have any questions for Sam or any reflections that you'd like to share in the chat box, that is open. And if it's a question, please put it in the form of a question and preface it by writing questions. So we can keep an eye on that. Sam, first of all, just want to make an emoji here. I'm gonna. That was just beautiful, so clear, so beautiful, and so deepening for all of us. So thank you, my friend, for that beautiful teaching. And I'm going to keep an eye on the chat box for questions, but I'm going to start with this question, Sam, which is, I know like yesterday, you were speaking clearly about the idea of understanding Jewish meditation as a prayer practice, right? And there's a word that I'm not sure if it's come up this week, but a term that's a classic of Jewish spirituality, dveikut, which literally means cleaving, which came up for me, and I was wondering about if you might want to say a few words about that, or whether where that comes into play here. It's a sense of in Jewish mindfulness meditation, the terminology often is this idea of being flush with our experience, becoming deeply connected in the way that you led us today so beautifully. Is that just another way of describing this, or is that a different thing altogether for you?
Well, I want to answer the question on two levels. One, on the level of the way that the Hasidic masters intended it, and then on the level of how I understand it through the lens of a mindfulness practice, which may be a little bit different, though not completely dissimilar. So what I've been pointing to is that consciousness itself, right? Not consciousness of this, that, or the other, but if we could really isolate consciousness itself and allow it to know its own nature, right? Which is to say, if we could become conscious of our consciousness or aware of our awareness, right? We may be surprised, as I was when I discovered this, or recognized it really. We may be surprised to learn that there's a part of us that's always been there, that is always there, that has no form, right? It's pure spirit. And as such, inherently and innately awake, luminous, loving, compassionate, and expansive, spacious.
If I can interrupt for a second, Sam,
Yeah.
would you also describe that as our neshama, our soul, our spirit?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And dveikut in the Hasidic sense means that you are resting in the light of the soul, right? And as such, you're proximate to the divine source from which that soul is hewn, right? In the way that, let's say, a wave is never separate from the ocean out of which it emerges as a separate entity, right? Yes, it may have its, individual expression, and movement, but it is never divorced or separate from the ocean. Right? So dveikut is really attaching ourselves. That's what the word literally means, right? Attaching or cleaving to, like the word devik in modern Hebrew, which means glue, right? Cleaving to the light of the soul, and by extension to its divine source. Okay,
which is just another way of describing what we engaged in today. Would you say?
Right. So from a mindfulness perspective, and I don't think this is completely out of step with the Hasidic teachings, right? We experience dveikut as well when the light of consciousness, the light of the soul, as it were, percolates down, right, or wells up from within, right, into the more form-bound dimensions of our being, right? So the practices we just did are meant to facilitate that, right? An infusion of consciousness in the body itself, an infusion of consciousness in the heart itself, right? That allows the body to become, as it were, the locus for an indwelling of divine presence, and the same for the heart.
Another question here, though, Sam, when you say that, I'm realizing, is it an infusion of consciousness in our form? Is it an awareness of the presence of that consciousness that we were asleep to? You know what I mean? It's like,
well, it's both, because yes, consciousness is always present in the body and always in the heart, but it may be dim or obscured by habit and all of the activity of the mind, right? So yes, we're unearthing what's already there, but we're also amplifying the magnitude and intensity, right? And when that happens, the body itself becomes less dense, it becomes more transparent. And the same is true with the heart, right? When the body is tense, tight, when it's caught in cycles of craving and aversion, it tends to become dense, right? And in the more dense forms, we experience tension and knots and blockages, right? And when the heart is in its kind of dense state, when it's defensive and guarded and closed, right, it tends to be fairly reactive. So what happens with this infusion of consciousness, at least in my experience, is that the body and the heart, and then eventually we'll see the mind, right, become lighter, more buoyant, more transparent, right, and as it were, somewhat purified and refined, right, and that's when we also begin to heal old karmic habits, especially if we're filling the heart with consciousness in this way, because a lot of our karmic habits are connected to habits of heart and mind, and then that karma manifests in the body. So we'll say more about the karmic piece and how to purify, old karmic buildup or negative emotional buildup. But I just want to say that in response to your question, it's really both.
Okay, there are a couple of very important questions here, one of which maybe it was where we left off yesterday. And I'm also going to mention I'm going to have to get off a couple of minutes early, I realize, because I'm bumping up against another session with Jonathan Slater at 1:30 Eastern. So, but
No
until
problem.
then, so here, I'll leave it in your hands. What to do when the body going into the body triggers strong emotions, maybe even as a trauma trigger?
Yeah, thanks, Mark.
I mean, you go ahead. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah. It's a really important question. I'm sure you have something to say about this as well, Mark. But
I was just going to compliment you for
Mhm.
offering the adaptation for people for whom, for example, breathing, the breath might have been be a trigger for trauma, and encouraging people to go to sound as an alternative. But
yeah. So, there's a book called The Body Keeps the Score, and it's all about the ways in which we hold trauma in our nervous system and, as such in the body. And what we're doing when we're meditating in this way is we're actually allowing everything to arise that may have been repressed or subdued. All of the stuff that was too painful for us as children or even as adults to really be with and look at and honor. So we essentially pushed it all down, right? And in mindfulness practice, it's like we're giving our whole system a green light and saying, it's safe. You can come out. I'm willing to look at you. I'm willing to see you. I'm willing to bear witness to you and validate you lovingly, right? So some of the hidden traumatic buildup is liable to come up at some point if we are trauma survivors. And sometimes we may not even know that we're trauma survivors, and suddenly that can come up and it can be felt in the body. Traditionally speaking, when that happens, it's often felt like in the core, right? Chest, abdomen, shoulders, back, solar plexus, and so on and so forth. So one skillful thing to do if that happens is to shift our attention to our extremities, right? Because there's another problem that arises when we experience those traumatic sensations in the body. That's called the Medusa problem, right? So for those who remember the story of Medusa, right? If you look straight into her face, right, you freeze, you become a statue, right? So the only way to actually work with Medusa is to kind of approach her while looking away, right? So we want to stay engaged with embodied practice because that's what helps us come into full presence, right? And magnify and augment and amplify the light of consciousness as a merkava, right? Upon which consciousness can rest. But on the other hand, we can't look directly at those painful feelings in the body because we'll freeze up, right? And we won't be able to progress in practice because the mind will become tight and narrow and the heart will become contracted and will become very dysregulated in our nervous system. And the practice is all about becoming regulated, right? At least as a kind of first step, right? We want a regulated nervous system that can essentially be with whatever arises with some degree of calm and equanimity and spaciousness. So what we do is we look away, right? And we redirect our attention to something that's not triggering. And for some, as I said, that could be diverting your attention to the extremities, sensations in the hands, the feet, even the knees, or the top of the head, the ears, right? So on and so forth. There's a lot of sensation in the ears. You may not be aware that there's a lot of sensation in the ears, but there is. And if that doesn't work, you can always take a break, right? And go take a little walk. Or as I offered yesterday, you can open your eyes and look around the room and situate yourself in the here and now. Because one of the things that happens when we're having a trauma response is that the mind is fooled into thinking that you're there and then, not here and now, right? And the body begins to feel as if you're actually in danger here and now. So by opening our eyes and looking around, we can reorient ourselves in the here and now, which can kind of help the nervous system come back to a baseline level of safety, right? And so we could look around and name 5 blue things we see in the room, right? 4 red things, 3 yellow things, 2 white things, 1 black thing, or 5 things we can hear in the room, 4 things we can see in the room, 3 things we can smell in the room, 2 things that we can touch in the room, and so on and so forth, right? And then maybe perhaps once we feel more regulated, we can come back in to the embodied anchor for our attention and to the prayer practice, right? And we can then maybe approach a little bit and come a little bit closer to what's painful and difficult. But again, not focusing directly into it, right? But maybe kind of dancing around the edges a little bit.
I am going to have to go in a sec, but there is another question, an important question about the surrender, about the second part, the year part, which I also thought that practice of of the ahava, yira, love, awe / fear / surrender practice was just beautiful and really very tangible way of experiencing that. There's a question from Susan about
just heads up, Mark, that we are also at about time.
Okay, well, question to maybe spill over into tomorrow is that I'm struggling with surrender. It felt good for me to think about it, a relief, but when to surrender? What's the role of surrender in general? Only during meditation, or is surrender kind of an act of passivity?
Mhm.
If I can, I'll take a shot at this in 30 seconds, which is that I thought what you said, when you said, I surrender, I'm here at your service, was a fantastic, that to me captured in a nutshell the idea that surrender is not subscribing to passivity. It's a release into awareness that allows us to take on a sense of service and responsibility. So I don't know. What do you think? You got 30 more seconds there.
Yeah, that sounds right. And also, we're not surrendering to some tyrant.
Mm-hmm.
We're surrendering into the luminous, loving radiance of the God field, right? So, that is a heart expanding experience in my experience, and not a heart closing or a tyrannizing experience.
All right, more on that tomorrow. Stay tuned for the exciting conclusion, Thursday and Friday with Sam. Thank you, Sam. This was fantastic. Thank you all for your beautiful practice, presence, and devotion to this. Thanks, Adi, and thanks, Valerie, and we'll see you all tomorrow.